The clocks inside Briarfield had stopped being wound 3 days before Asa Griggs Candler drew his final breath. Whether this was oversight or intention, no member of the household staff ever clarified. What is known is that on the evening of March 12, 1929, the 77-year-old founder of the Coca-Cola Company lay motionless in an upstairs bedroom of the estate, surrounded by silence and the faint smell of magnolia drifting through half-open windows. Outside, Atlanta continued its ordinary rhythms. Inside, the machinery of an empire prepared for transition. The official cause of death would be recorded as complications following a stroke suffered weeks earlier. The announcement, when it came, was measured and brief. Newspapers across the nation would print variations of the same authorized portrait: a self-made man, a philanthropist, a pillar of Southern enterprise. What they did not print, what no publication of that era chose to examine, was the nature of the world Candler had constructed behind the hedgerows and iron gates of his private domain. Briarfield itself sat on a gentle rise in the Druid Hills section of Atlanta, a neighborhood Candler had helped design and develop according to his precise specifications. The house was substantial, but not ostentatious by the standards of Gilded Age wealth. Its architecture suggested permanence rather than display: brick walls, deep porches, rooms arranged for function as much as impression. This was not a palace meant to dazzle visitors. It was a fortress meant to contain something. By 1929, the Coca-Cola formula, the central secret upon which the family fortune rested, had already become one of the most guarded commercial mysteries in American history. Candler himself had cultivated this aura of inscrutability from the earliest days of his ownership. He spoke of the formula rarely and always in elliptical terms. He allowed no written copies to circulate. He compartmentalized knowledge among his chemists so that no single employee possessed the complete recipe. The vault at the Trust Company of Georgia, where the formula was said to reside, became less a storage facility than a shrine to corporate mystique. But the secrecy extended far beyond syrup and ingredients. Within Briarfield, Candler maintained systems of control that mirrored his business philosophy. Household accounts were reviewed personally. Correspondence was filed and cross-referenced. Visitors were received according to strict protocols, their names logged, their purposes noted. Even family members operated within boundaries that Candler himself had drawn. His 5 children, Howard, Asa Jr., Lucy, William, and Walter, had grown up understanding that access to their father required navigation through layers of formality and expectation. On that March evening, as Candler's breathing slowed and finally ceased, the question of what would happen next hung over the household like humidity before a summer storm. The Coca-Cola Company had already been sold to a consortium led by Ernest Woodruff in 1919, a transaction that netted the Candler family approximately $25 million. But the sale had not ended the family's entanglement with questions of legacy, control, and the stories they chose to tell about themselves. In the weeks following the funeral, certain items began to disappear from Briarfield: personal papers, ledgers, correspondence dating back decades. Whether these removals were conducted under instruction, left by Candler himself, or initiated by family members seeking to shape the historical record remains unclear. What is certain is that by the time biographers and historians began examining the Candler legacy in earnest, significant gaps existed in the documentary evidence. Entire periods of his life remained accessible only through second-hand accounts and family-approved narratives. The public Asa Candler, the benefactor who funded Emory University, the mayor who guided Atlanta through wartime challenges, the churchman who tithed generously and spoke often of moral duty, was a figure constructed as carefully as any advertising campaign. The private Candler, the one who lived and died within the walls of Briarfield, remained largely inaccessible. His motivations, his doubts, His methods of maintaining authority over both enterprise and family, these resided in the silences between official statements. As night settled fully over Druid Hills on March 12, 1929, the household staff at Briarfield began the rituals of mourning, according to customs Candler himself had likely specified years in advance. Curtains were drawn, mirrors were covered. A telegram was dispatched to family members not present. The body was prepared for viewing with the discretion expected of the Southern elite. Somewhere in the darkness of the house, behind doors that would soon be permanently closed to outside inquiry, the collected papers of a man who had built an empire on controlled information awaited their fate. Some would survive. Many would not. The story that emerged in the following decades would be the story the Candler family permitted to be told. Asa Griggs Candler arrived in Atlanta in 1873 with what he later described as $1.75 in his pocket. The figure may have been precisely accurate or slightly embellished for narrative effect. Candler understood the power of origin stories long before he understood the power of carbonated beverages. What is documented is that he was 21 years old, the seventh of 11 children born to a merchant family in Villa Rica, Georgia, and that he carried with him a rudimentary knowledge of pharmacy, acquired through apprenticeship rather than formal education. The Atlanta he encountered was a city still rebuilding from the devastations of the Civil War. Sherman's march had left scars that remained visible in empty lots and provisional structures. But the same destruction that had leveled the old order had also cleared space for ambitious men, unencumbered by antebellum hierarchies. Candler recognized opportunity in the chaos. Within months of his arrival, he had secured employment with a pharmaceutical firm. Within years, he had established his own drugstore. By his early 30s, he was a moderately successful businessman, with a growing reputation for shrewdness and an almost religious commitment to efficiency. The transaction that would transform his life occurred in stages between 1888 and 1891. John Pemberton, a pharmacist and Confederate veteran, had developed a medicinal syrup he called Coca-Cola in 1886. The formula combined coca leaf extract, cola nut, and various other ingredients into a tonic marketed for headaches and fatigue. Pemberton, however, was aging, unwell, and in need of capital. He began selling portions of his ownership to various investors, creating a tangled web of competing claims that would later require legal untangling. Candler's acquisition of the formula was neither simple nor entirely transparent. He purchased rights from multiple parties, negotiated with Pemberton's heirs after the inventor's death in 1888, and eventually consolidated complete ownership through methods that some contemporaries found aggressive. The total cost of acquiring Coca-Cola, including the formula, the brand name, and all associated equipment, came to approximately $2,300 spread across several transactions. Within a decade, the company would be valued in the millions. What Candler possessed that Pemberton had lacked was not chemical knowledge, but organizational vision. He understood that the product itself mattered less than the systems surrounding it. Distribution networks, franchise arrangements, advertising campaigns calibrated to regional tastes and seasonal demands. He transformed Coca-Cola from a local curiosity into a national phenomenon through relentless systematization of every aspect of the business. Central to this systematization was the cultivation of secrecy around the formula. Candler grasped intuitively what later marketing theorists would articulate explicitly: that mystery creates value. He began referring to the recipe as a sacred trust, something entrusted to him that he was obligated to protect. He limited knowledge of the complete formula to himself and, eventually, to a small circle of family members and trusted associates bound by oaths of confidentiality that carried both legal and personal weight. The vault became a recurring motif in Candler's management of perception. When he deposited what he claimed was the only written copy of the formula at the Trust Company of Georgia, he ensured that the event was noted and discussed. The vault itself became a character in the Coca-Cola story, a physical manifestation of the secret that supposedly resided within. Whether the document inside contained the actual complete formula, a partial version, or something else entirely, was known only to Candler himself. The power lay not in the paper, but in the narrative surrounding it. At Briarfield, these same principles of controlled information extended into domestic life. Candler ran his household with the precision of a commercial enterprise. Expenditures were tracked. Schedules were maintained. His wife, Lucy Elizabeth Howard Candler, managed the daily operations of the home, but did so within parameters her husband established. Their children were raised with expectations of discipline, religious observance, and loyalty to family interests that superseded individual desires. The Candler children learned early that their father's affection was inseparable from his expectations. Howard, the eldest son, was groomed for leadership within the company. Asa Jr. received responsibilities calibrated to his perceived capabilities. The daughters were educated and provided for, but directed toward domestic futures appropriate to their station. Each child occupied a specific position within the family structure, their roles defined as clearly as those of employees within the corporate hierarchy. By the turn of the century, Asa Candler had achieved a level of wealth and influence that placed him among the most powerful men in the American South. His portrait hung in boardrooms and civic buildings. His name appeared on university buildings and hospital wings. His opinions on matters of commerce and morality carried weight in circles far beyond Atlanta. Yet even at the height of his public prominence, he maintained the habits of concealment that had served him from the beginning. The formula remained locked away. The family remained unified in its public presentation. The machinery of image management continued its quiet operations behind the walls of Briarfield. The rituals of secrecy at Briarfield were not performed for dramatic effect. They emerged from a philosophy Candler had refined over decades of commercial practice, the conviction that information, once released, could never be recaptured. He applied this principle to business correspondence, to family matters, to the management of his public reputation, and most conspicuously to the formula that had made everything else possible. Within the Coca-Cola Company, Candler established protocols that divided knowledge into compartments. The men who sourced raw ingredients knew nothing of proportions. The chemists who mixed components worked with coded instructions that obscured the complete picture. Bottlers and distributors received finished syrup without access to its composition. This fragmentation was deliberate and systematic. No single point of failure could compromise the whole. No disgruntled employee could walk away with the complete secret. The same architecture of controlled information extended to Briarfield itself. Candler maintained a private study on the second floor, where he conducted business that required absolute discretion. The room contained a safe, smaller than the famous vault at the Trust Company, but no less significant in household mythology. What resided inside varied according to which family member later offered recollections. Some spoke of business documents. Others mentioned personal correspondence. A few suggested that duplicate formula materials were kept there as insurance against catastrophe. Candler himself never clarified, and the ambiguity served his purposes. Household staff operated under expectations of discretion that went beyond ordinary employer-employee relationships. Servants at Briarfield understood that conversations overheard were never to be repeated. Visitors were announced formally and received in designated spaces. The family's private quarters remained inaccessible to all but the most trusted attendants. Those who violated these unwritten codes did not remain employed for long. Candler's standards in domestic service mirrored his standards in commerce. Loyalty was rewarded. Indiscretion was not forgiven. Lucy Elizabeth, his wife of nearly 4 decades, navigated this environment with a combination of accommodation and quiet endurance. She had married Asa Candler in 1878, before the Coca-Cola acquisition, before the wealth, before Briarfield existed even as a concept. She had witnessed the transformation of her husband from ambitious young pharmacist to industrial titan. Whatever private observations she accumulated over those years remained largely unrecorded. Her public role was that of the gracious Southern matron, present at church functions, visible at appropriate social gatherings, silent on matters of business or controversy. Her death in 1919 coincided almost exactly with the sale of the Coca-Cola Company to the Woodruff Consortium. Whether the timing was coincidental or whether Candler had delayed the transaction during her illness remains a matter of speculation. What is documented is that within months of burying his wife, Candler divested himself of the enterprise that had defined his adult life. The sale price of $25 million represented an almost incomprehensible return on his original investment of $2,300. Yet those who observed him in the aftermath noted something other than triumph in his demeanor. The years following the sale revealed dimensions of Candler's character that his decades of careful image management had obscured. In 1923, at the age of 71, he remarried. His new wife was Onésima de Buchel, a woman of New Orleans origin, whose background and motivations became subjects of intense family scrutiny. The marriage was brief and troubled. Within months, Candler's children had initiated legal proceedings, questioning their father's mental competency and the validity of the union. The resulting court battles exposed family tensions that had previously remained hidden behind Briarfield's carefully maintained facades. Testimony during these proceedings suggested that Candler's grip on practical affairs had loosened considerably since the company sale. Witnesses described confusion, vulnerability to influence, and departures from the rigid self-control that had characterized his earlier decades. His children argued that Onésima had manipulated an aging man whose judgment was impaired. The courts eventually annulled the marriage, but not before the public had glimpsed a version of Asa Candler that contradicted every authorized narrative. The episode revealed something essential about the family's relationship to information control. When circumstances forced private matters into public view, the Candlers responded with the same strategies their patriarch had employed in business: aggressive action, unified messaging, and swift closure of any narrative that threatened the approved version of events. The annulment was secured. Onésima departed. The family closed ranks. Within months, the incident had been relegated to footnotes, mentioned rarely and only in carefully qualified terms. Candler himself retreated further into the confines of Briarfield. His final years were spent in diminishing circles of activity, his world contracting to the rooms and routines of the estate. Visitors became fewer. Public appearances ceased almost entirely. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and shaped the commercial landscape of an entire region now occupied a single bedroom in a house filled with the accumulated evidence of his achievements and the deepening silence of his decline. The children of Asa Griggs Candler inherited more than wealth. They inherited a system, a set of expectations, obligations, and unspoken rules that governed how a Candler moved through the world. Each of the 5 siblings who survived to adulthood understood that their family name carried weight that could open doors, or, if mishandled, invite scrutiny that their father had spent decades deflecting. They had been raised to protect the name, to amplify its prestige, and never to provide ammunition to those who might wish the family ill. Howard, the eldest, assumed the mantle of corporate leadership with the seriousness his father expected. He served as president of the Coca-Cola Company during the years before the 1919 sale and understood intimately the mechanisms of control that kept the enterprise functioning. His relationship with his father was formal, even by the standards of their era, respectful, dutiful, but marked by a distance that neither man seemed inclined to bridge. Howard had learned the family business by observation and gradual inclusion. He had not learned warmth. Asa Jr. followed a different trajectory. Where Howard embodied discipline, Asa Jr. displayed tendencies toward flamboyance that caused his father periodic concern. His business ventures ranged from real estate development to automobile racing, pursuits that generated publicity of a kind the senior Candler found uncomfortable. Yet even Asa Jr. understood limits. His public persona, however colorful, never threatened the core family narratives. He remained loyal to the collective enterprise, even as he carved spaces for individual expression. The daughters, Lucy, the eldest child, and her younger sister who died in childhood, occupied positions defined primarily by marriage and social obligation. Lucy Candler married and became Lucy Candler Heinz, her identity thereafter linked to her husband's family as much as her own. She maintained close ties to Briarfield and participated in the management of family affairs, but her influence operated through domestic channels rather than boardroom authority. This was the arrangement her father considered natural and appropriate. William and Walter, the younger sons, received portions of the family fortune calibrated to their perceived stations. Neither achieved the prominence of Howard or the notoriety of Asa Jr. They managed investments, participated in civic activities, and maintained the Candler presence in Atlanta society without generating headlines. Their contributions to the family legacy were measured in stability rather than expansion. They held positions. They attended functions. They signed documents when required. The machinery continued. What bound these disparate personalities together was not affection alone, but shared investment in the family's public image. They had witnessed their father's methods, the careful cultivation of reputation, the strategic deployment of philanthropy, the absolute commitment to controlling information about internal affairs. They understood that the Candler name functioned as a brand requiring the same protection as Coca-Cola itself. Disagreements occurred, but they occurred privately. The family presented unity to the outside world, regardless of whatever tensions simmered within. Briarfield served as the physical anchor of this collective identity. The estate was not merely a residence, but a stage upon which family rituals were performed, according to established scripts. Holiday gatherings followed predictable patterns. Business discussions occurred in designated spaces. Children and grandchildren learned early which rooms were accessible and which remained reserved for adult concerns. The house itself enforced hierarchies that words never needed to articulate. The grounds surrounding the main residence extended these principles into landscape. Gardens were maintained with precision. Pathways directed movement along approved routes. Boundaries between the Candler property and neighboring estates were marked clearly, separating the family's private domain from the broader community of Druid Hills that Asa Candler had helped create. Even the approach to Briarfield was choreographed. Visitors passed through gates, traversed a drive designed to impress without overwhelming, and arrived at an entrance that communicated substance and permanence. Within this carefully constructed environment, Candler had conducted the business of being a public figure while maintaining fierce protection of private space. He received politicians, clergy, and business associates in rooms designed for such encounters. He granted interviews selectively, and always with attention to how his words might appear in print. He posed for photographs that reinforced the image of benevolent patriarch, seated in his study, surrounded by books and family portraits, the picture of Southern respectability. These images circulated widely and shaped public perception for generations. What the photographs did not capture was the infrastructure of control operating just beyond the frame, the filing systems, the locked cabinets, the staff trained to manage access and deflect unwanted inquiry, the rooms where certain conversations never occurred because the participants understood, without being told, that some subjects remained permanently closed. Briarfield was a house of surfaces, and beneath every surface lay mechanisms designed to prevent deeper examination. The vault at the Trust Company of Georgia became, over time, more significant as symbol than as security measure. Candler had understood from the beginning that the physical protection of the formula mattered less than the story told about its protection. Safes could be opened, documents could be copied, chemists with sufficient skill could reverse engineer a syrup through analysis. What could not be replicated was the aura of sacred mystery that transformed a beverage recipe into something approaching secular relic. The rituals surrounding the vault were performed with deliberate theatricality. When the formula required consultation for adjustments to production or verification of supplier specifications, the process involved multiple key holders, witnessed access, and careful documentation of every interaction with the protected document. These procedures served practical purposes, certainly. They prevented unauthorized access and created accountability, but they also generated stories. Employees who participated in vault rituals carried those experiences outward, sharing them in ways that reinforced the mythology Candler had constructed. Outside observers occasionally questioned whether the elaborate security was proportionate to the actual value of what it protected. The formula, after all, was a recipe, a list of ingredients and proportions that any competent chemist could theoretically reproduce given sufficient information. Competitors had attempted exactly this, producing beverages that mimicked the Coca-Cola taste with varying degrees of success. None had captured the market position that Candler's product maintained. This suggested that the formula alone did not account for the company's dominance. What Candler had created was something more complex than a successful soft drink. He had created a system in which secrecy itself became a selling point. Consumers were not merely purchasing a beverage. They were participating in a mystery, consuming something whose precise nature remained tantalizingly unknown. The vault and its contents represented this unknown quantity in physical form. As long as the secret remained locked away, the product retained an element of magic that transparent manufacturing could never provide. This insight, that controlled information creates value beyond its practical content, shaped Candler's approach to every aspect of his enterprise. Advertising campaigns emphasized the unique and irreplaceable nature of Coca-Cola without ever specifying what made it so. Competitors could claim similar refreshment, similar taste, similar quality. They could not claim the secret. The formula's mystique became a competitive advantage that no amount of imitation could overcome. At Briarfield, similar principles governed the management of family information. The Candlers understood that their position in Atlanta society depended not only on wealth, but on perception. They cultivated an image of stability, propriety, and continuity that required constant maintenance. Scandals were contained. Disagreements were resolved privately. The family presented a unified facade to the community, regardless of whatever complications occurred behind closed doors. The 1923 marriage crisis had tested these mechanisms severely. For a brief period, the careful separation between public image and private reality had collapsed. Court proceedings had forced family matters into newspaper columns. Testimony had revealed vulnerabilities that contradicted the authorized narrative of Candler as infallible patriarch. The family's response demonstrated how thoroughly they had internalized their father's methods. They mobilized legal resources, managed press coverage, and ultimately closed the breach through the annulment that restored, if not the previous reality, at least the appearance of order. What the episode revealed was the fragility underlying all systems of controlled information. Candler had spent decades constructing barriers between what the public knew and what actually occurred within his family and business. These barriers had held through challenges, competitors, and the ordinary pressures of commercial life. But they required constant reinforcement. A single point of failure, an aging patriarch whose judgment wavered, a marriage that introduced an outsider into the inner circle, could compromise the entire structure. The years following the crisis saw intensified efforts to restore and maintain the family's carefully constructed image. Biographical accounts emphasized Candler's philanthropy and civic contributions, while minimizing or omitting the troubled final chapter. The Emory University connection received particular attention. Candler's donations had transformed a struggling Methodist college into a major research institution, and this legacy provided a foundation for positive narrative that could overshadow less flattering details. Briarfield itself became increasingly important as a symbol of continuity during this period. The estate represented physical proof that the Candler family remained rooted, stable, and committed to their place in Atlanta's social landscape. Maintaining the property to appropriate standards was not merely a matter of comfort, but of reputation. The house and grounds testified to the family's ongoing prosperity and their connection to the community their patriarch had helped build. Every manicured hedge and polished floor communicated messages that words alone could not convey. The Coca-Cola formula remained in its vault long after Asa Candler ceased to have any direct connection to the company he had built. The sale to Ernest Woodruff's consortium in 1919 had transferred ownership, but not mythology. The new leadership understood what Candler had always understood, that the secret itself was an asset requiring careful stewardship. They maintained the rituals of protection, the limited access, the theatrical security measures that kept the mystery alive in public imagination. For the Candler family, this continuation presented a peculiar situation. They had surrendered control of the enterprise, but remained permanently associated with its most famous element. Journalists and curious members of the public continued to approach family members with questions about the formula decades after the sale. Did they still know the secret? Had it been passed down through generations? Were there Candlers alive who could, if they chose, reveal what resided in that vault? The family responded to such inquiries with the deflection techniques their patriarch had perfected: polite evasion, references to confidentiality obligations, suggestions that some questions were simply not appropriate to answer. Whether any Candler after Asa himself possessed genuine knowledge of the complete formula remains unclear. The senior Candler had compartmentalized information so thoroughly that even family members operated with incomplete pictures. Howard, who had led the company before the sale, certainly knew more than his siblings. But whether his knowledge extended to every ingredient, every proportion, every detail of the manufacturing process was a question he never definitively answered. The ambiguity served the family's interests. As long as uncertainty persisted, they retained a connection to the mystery that had made their fortune. Briarfield, in the years following Asa Candler's death, became a repository of accumulated history. The house contained decades of material evidence, furniture selected by Lucy Elizabeth, artwork acquired during prosperous years, personal effects that traced the arc of a family's rise to prominence. Some of these items carried stories that family members shared selectively. Others resided in rooms and cabinets that younger generations learned not to disturb. The estate was simultaneously a home and an archive, its contents sorted into categories of accessible and restricted. The children who had gathered at Briarfield for their father's final days dispersed into their separate lives, while maintaining connections to the property and to each other. Howard continued his business activities with the measured approach that had always characterized his conduct. Asa Jr. pursued ventures that occasionally generated the publicity his father would have discouraged. The family's collective wealth, though diminished from its peak by the 1919 sales distribution among heirs and the subsequent economic turbulence of the 1930s, remained substantial enough to insulate them from ordinary concerns. Atlanta itself was transforming during these decades. The city that Asa Candler had known, a regional center still recovering from Civil War devastation, was becoming something larger and more complex. New industries arrived. New families accumulated influence. The old hierarchies that had placed men like Candler at the apex of local society were gradually complicated by newcomers who owed nothing to established networks. The Candler name retained its prestige, but that prestige now competed with other names, other fortunes, other claims to civic significance. Druid Hills, the neighborhood Candler had helped develop, according to his specifications, evolved as well. The careful planning that had characterized its original design gave way to modifications, subdivisions, and the ordinary pressures of urban growth. Properties changed hands. New construction altered sightlines and relationships between estates. The exclusive enclave that Candler had envisioned became, over time, simply another affluent Atlanta neighborhood, distinguished certainly, but no longer exceptional in the way its founders had intended. Briarfield's position within this changing landscape grew increasingly anomalous. The estate represented a scale of private residence that subsequent generations found difficult to justify or maintain. The costs of preserving such a property, the staff required, the repairs demanded by aging infrastructure, the taxes assessed on valuable land, mounted steadily. Family members faced decisions about whether the house served ongoing purposes or had become primarily a monument to a receding past. These deliberations occurred privately, consistent with family tradition. No public announcements accompanied the gradual shifts in how Briarfield was used and maintained. Rooms that had once hosted gatherings fell into disuse. Staff was reduced. Certain maintenance was deferred. The house remained in family hands, but its role in family life contracted. It became a place visited rather than inhabited, a symbol referenced rather than a home actively occupied. The papers and records that Asa Candler had accumulated over his lifetime underwent their own quiet transitions during these years. Some materials were donated to institutions. Emory University received documents relating to Candler's philanthropic activities, carefully selected to support the narrative of generous benefactor. Other materials remained in family possession, their contents known only to those who held them. Still others, by various accounts, were destroyed. What criteria governed these decisions, who made them, and what was lost in the process became questions that later researchers would find impossible to answer definitively. Briarfield did not survive as a Candler property into the present day. The estate that Asa Griggs Candler had constructed as headquarters for his private empire passed out of family hands through transactions that occurred with little public attention. The house that had witnessed the patriarch's final breath, that had contained the filing systems and locked cabinets and carefully managed spaces of his controlled world, became simply another piece of Atlanta real estate, valuable for its land and location rather than its history. The structure itself underwent the transformations that aging estates typically endure when original purposes no longer apply. Subsequent owners modified rooms to suit different needs. Gardens were redesigned or simplified. The specific configurations that Candler had established, the study where confidential business was conducted, the quarters where staff maintained their discrete operations, lost their original significance as the house adapted to inhabitants with no connection to its founding mythology. What remained was not the physical estate, but the patterns of information management that Candler had established and his descendants had perpetuated. The formula stayed in its vault, transferred to new facilities as the Coca-Cola company grew, but never released from the rituals of secrecy that its original owner had instituted. The family maintained their selective approach to historical inquiry, cooperating with researchers whose work aligned with approved narratives, while declining access to materials that might complicate the established story. The documentary record of Asa Candler's life reflects these sustained efforts at curation. Biographies rely heavily on sources the family deemed appropriate for public consumption. The gaps, the missing correspondence, the destroyed ledgers, the conversations that occurred in rooms designed for confidentiality, remain gaps. Historians acknowledge these limitations while working within them, producing accounts that are necessarily incomplete, because completeness was precisely what Candler and his heirs sought to prevent. Atlanta grew around and beyond the spaces the Candler family had once dominated. The city that now hosts the Coca-Cola Company's global headquarters bears little resemblance to the recovering southern town, where a young pharmacist arrived with limited capital and unlimited ambition. The Candler name persists on buildings and street signs, historical markers and institutional acknowledgements, but these traces function as monuments rather than living presences, reminders of influence that once was, rather than power currently exercised. The formula remains officially secret. Whether its contents could still surprise anyone with access to modern analytical chemistry is a question the company has never needed to answer. The value of the secret long ago transcended its practical content. What Candler created was not merely a recipe, but a demonstration of how mystery itself could be manufactured, maintained, and converted into commercial advantage across generations. Briarfield is gone. The clocks that stopped before Candler's death were never rewound. The papers that disappeared in the weeks after his funeral have never resurfaced. What endures is the silence he cultivated, a silence that continues to shape what can be known about the man, the family, and the empire they built together in the decades when Atlanta was becoming something new, and a formula locked in a vault was becoming something like a secular holy relic. The magnolias still bloom in Druid Hills each spring. The houses that remain from Candler's era stand among newer construction, distinguished but no longer dominant. Somewhere in climate-controlled storage, documents survive that might answer questions biographers have learned not to ask. The answers remain where Asa Griggs Candler always intended them to remain, out of reach, under control, protected by the systems he designed for exactly this purpose.